Chapter 10. "I hope the Bayport police communicate with the authorities in New York," Frank remarked. "If they meet the train and arrest Chris, our worries will be over." "And if they don't?" Joe asked. Frankie gave a wan smile. "Our troubles will just be starting. There'll be crowds and it'll be tough to keep track of them." The train did not make many stops, but each time it did, Frank and Joe were ready to hop off in case Chris should get a light. At length the train reached the suburbs and clattered past miles of factories and houses, and finally lurched to a halt in the underground station in New York City. The boys watched Chris intently as the passengers prepared to leave. The fair-haired man did not look back once. He put on his hat and strode towards the front of the car. "We'll get out at the back and keep an eye on him from there," Frank said. The Hardys scrambled onto the platform, where the passengers were just beginning to fill up the ramp to the waiting room. Chris had not yet appeared, so the brothers, shielding their faces, made their way quickly to the exit gate. "I don't see any police," Frank remarked, disappointed. "No," Joe replied. "I guess we'll have to take over." The boys emerged into the concourse. There, in the enormous, high-vaulted station, booming with hollow echoes, they waited for Chris to appear. He stalked through the gate, looking neither right nor left, and the boys quickly fell in behind him. He towered above the throng, and they had little difficulty following him. Despite the crowds that jostled them, the Hardys managed to keep Chris in view and pursue him into the street. "What do we do if he hops into a taxi?" Joe asked. "I guess we'll hop into one ourselves and hope we can trail him," Frank said. "I'd feel better if we had more money with us," Joe grumbled. The man they were trailing seemed almost unaware that he was being followed. "It's going to be hard to find one taxi to follow another one in this traffic," Frank remarked. "Well, maybe we won't need one," his brother suggested. "Anyhow, those New York taxi drivers are pretty clever. I think if we tell one to follow a car we point out and make it worth his while, he could do it." "That's going to cost a lot of moolah," Frank said. They were relieved when their quarry continued walking. "Come on," Frank called. The two sleuths had a twofold problem: to follow Chris and be careful that he did not suspect they were after him. Twice he swung around while they were hurrying along the crowded sidewalk, and it seemed as if he was suspicious. On these occasions the boys dodged back behind passerbyers, and after two momentary surveys, Chris hastened on again. "I don't think he saw us," Frank murmured as they again took up the chase. "No, evidently not, but we're coming to some pretty heavy congestion up here. Look at the crowd. There's traffic signals. If he gets across the street ahead of us and you and I are held up by a red light, we'll lose him." The boys were anxious as they approached a busy corner, where a policeman was directing the flow of automobiles and pedestrians. "Should we ask for his help?" Joe asked. "I doubt he could leave his post," Frank answered. Just what Joe had feared took place. Chris was among the last to slip across the thoroughfare before the lights flashed green to red, and the officer blew his whistle sharply, and Joe groaned. "Just our luck," he cried. "Look!" Frank exclaimed. "We are in luck." Chris was evidently speaking to a man on the other side of the street. The stranger had been asking for directions, and Chris had halted to explain and point out the location of a certain street. He took such pains with the man that by the time he finished, the traffic light again turned flashing green. "Let's go!" Joe cried. They trailed Chris along the street for several blocks, and then he turned into a large office building. Inside, with a row of elevators opposing the entrance, Frank and Joe hastened a few seconds about, following Chris. "Come on," Joe urged. "If he gets onto an elevator and we aren't there, we won't know what office he's going to." "You're right." They hurried into the lobby just as Chris stepped into one of the cars. The door closed, and he shot upward. Fortunately, he was only a passenger, and the boys watched the dial. The car stopped on the 10th floor. "Well, I hope we don't get away." "We never would have dared get into the same elevator with him. He'd have sure recognized it." The boys stepped into the next car. It was soon filled up and shot up, leaving passengers off at various floors, and the boys left it on the 10th. Each wondered if they could locate Chris in the maze of offices. Again, luck was with them. As Frank and Joe looked down a corridor, Chris was just entering an office. Evidently, he had been delayed looking for his destination. The Hardys hurried to the door as it closed behind the suspect. It was a green painted steel door with an open transom, and the sign read, South African Importing Company Wholesale Only. Well, I wonder what he's doing in there, Joe murmured. Frank put a finger to his lips. The sound of muffled voices could be heard from the office. Apparently, Chris and the others inside were so far from the door that their conversation was indistinct. A moment later, Chris's voice came loud and clear. He must be walking towards the outer door. We gotta scram, Frank advised. When he comes out, should we grab him? Joe asked. Joe shook his head. If those are buddies of his, they'll grab us. The boys scooted up the corridor and watched Chris over their shoulders. He did not notice Frank and Joe. The suspect was looking intently at some papers in his hand as he went to the elevators and pushed a button for an ascending car. He was going to a higher floor. Shall we follow him? Too risky. Let's go down and wait in the lobby, and then we'll take up the trail again. After Chris had gone up, the boys took a down car. On the elevator floor, they watched each descending elevator. After half an hour had passed, their patience was rewarded. Amid a carload of businessmen, they saw the burly form of the big blond man towering above all the others. Come on, Frank whispered to Joe as Chris moved towards the city streets. Again, the chase was resumed on the crowded street. For several blocks, Chris maintained a straight course, and they swung around the corner and stalked down a side street. The sleuths hurried after their quarry and saw him dip beneath a restaurant sign below street level. Uh-oh, Joe murmured. If we follow him in there, he won't miss us for sure. Well, let's first see how many customers are inside, Frank suggested. If so, we might be able to get away with it. Could be he's meeting someone there. Frank went down the steps leading to the restaurant and made a quick survey of the place through the door. It was almost full. Chris has taken a table at the rear, and he's not facing the door. Come on, Joe. We're not letting him out of our sight. Boldly, Frank and Joe entered the place. It was a cheap restaurant with booths along each one side. The boys slipped inside quietly with one of the compartments. They could watch Chris, but he couldn't see them. Well, this is sure a break, Joe whispered. An untidy-looking waitress came over and they took their orders. After he had gone to the kitchen, the boys put their money on the table. There'll be enough to pay for a hotel room if we have to stay over and a few more meals. We sure can't afford to hang around New York for long, though, Joe remarked, eyeing their available cash. I guess we better tell the police about Chris and forget trying to spot his buddies. Suddenly, Frank sat bolt upright. Chris is getting up from his table. Leaping lizards! He's heading right for us, Joe exclaimed. End of chapter 10.